Well, I wanted to start by saying good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this session of Cities on the Frontline. I'm Alison Ahern from Resilient Cities Network, and I'm really excited today for this session that will highlight the really unique program, which is the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship. For a bit of background, Cities on the Frontline is a virtual thought leadership speaker series featuring solutions by cities for cities. It began in 2020 through a partnership between the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank Group's City Resilience Program. The series provides city practitioners and the industries and residents that they support with a platform for knowledge exchange. Today's session of the Cities on the Frontline is hosted with the support of the Howden Group. Before we start, I wanted to just take a moment to remind everyone of the intentions of the speaker series and the ground rules for the conversation. The purpose of these global seminars are to have an open and honest learning conversation. So we ask you not to attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so. And we can always help you obtain this permission if you need. Please note that the recording of today's session will be posted online, as well as the summary and the presentation materials on our website after the session. And we have about 360 registered participants for today's call. So to facilitate this discussion, we ask that you write your questions in the Q&A function of the chat, and also welcome you to introduce yourselves using the chat function as well. And with that, I'm happy to say that this session will be co-hosted with Wadesa Rukato from Howden. But before I pass it over to Wadesa, I would like to invite Lauren Sorkin, the Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network, to say a few words. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's great to be back on Cities on the Frontline, and in particular for this session, which really dives into resilience and finance. At Resilient Cities Network, we realized very early on that insurance had a critical role to play in supporting city resilience efforts. And that's why we have partnered over the last 2 years with Howden and with other members of the Sustainable Markets Initiative to create a Risk and Resilience Fellowship to help cities to develop better tools that can protect vulnerable communities, to be ready and to be financially resilient to climate-related shocks and stresses. Over the last 2 years, the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship has worked with 10 cities. And if you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage you to take a look at the report that was just launched on the results from the fellowship. It's on our LinkedIn and on our website, the Resilient Cities Network, and on the Howden Group website as well. Through this program, over the last 2 years, we have been working to ensure that cities can gain knowledge from seasoned resilience professionals, not just for one project, but across their entire portfolio. And we are so thrilled that collaborative partnerships between cities, insurance practitioners, and other stakeholders are really taking off. These are essential for driving innovation and adaptation to evolving climate risks. We are so happy to have guests from 2 cities here today to share their case studies with you and to demonstrate how their different approaches are guiding investments and adaptation strategies for cities. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Wadesa to take us forward.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I'm Wadesa Rukato, and I sit in the Climate Risk and Resilience team at Howden, where we're focused on reimagining the potential of insurance to meet the challenges and the opportunities of a nature-positive net zero transition. A core part of this involves working with clients, partners, communities, and in this case, city leaders, to understand their exposure to climate risks and to transform how we're collectively thinking about insurance by considering its potential to act as an enabler for accelerating resilience. The theme of today's Cities on the Frontline session is de-risking the future, climate risk, public-private collaboration, and the value of insurance. This theme reflects a common thread across nearly all of this year's fellowship projects, which was how city leaders can strategically use insurance to advance investment in climate adaptive infrastructure and to strengthen the financial resilience of communities. Across all of the fellowship projects this year, teams have considered, to varying extents, how insurance can be used to clear obstacles to investment and to mobilize the capital required to accelerate adaptation at speed and scale. Today, you'll hear from the city leaders and fellows that delivered the fellowship project in Greater Manchester and in Cape Town. Both projects sought to develop methodologies for calculating the complex costs of climate risks to inform strategies for action and to build investment cases for adaptation. Both projects also reflect the intent of the fellowship, which is to support city leaders with the tools, the expertise, and the connections that can help accelerate resilience building. Through the discussion today, we hope to highlight the importance of public-private collaboration, but also the critical role that the private sector needs to play alongside city leaders to protect communities and to deliver future resilient cities. A quick aside and a note just to say that going forward, as we kind of move this fellowship program forward, we're really keen to strengthen private sector collaboration and involvement in its delivery. And so as you kind of participate today and as you listen to the projects from the two cities we're profiling, if you're keen to work together or if you have any questions about the program, please do reach out to either Alison or myself. Would love to be in touch. And with all that said, we'll now get into the session. I'll begin by introducing our wonderful panelists for today. From the City of Cape Town, we have Daniel Sullivan, who's the Director of Risk and Resilience for the City of Cape Town. We also have Peter Adams from Howden, who is the lead fellow for Cape Town, and he led the delivery of the fellowship project in that city. From Greater Manchester, we have Sharon Miller, who is the Senior Policy Advisor in Greater Manchester's Resilience Unit. We also have Adam Lechmere, who leads climate and resilience strategy management at United Utilities. So that's the regional water provider for Greater Manchester. And then we have, again from Howden, the lead fellow for this project, Erin, Owain, who essentially kind of led the delivery of that project. We'll first hear from the Cape Town Fellowship team, after which we'll hear from the Fellowship team from Greater Manchester. And then we'll open up to a Q&A and discussion. Peter and Daniel, I'll now hand over to you to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Wadeza. And thanks, Alison, for controlling the slides. All right, well, good morning to everybody from New York, and a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. And it's been a pleasure working with the City of Cape Town and the Resilient Cities Network on this project. It's been a yeah, very, very interesting and I think meaningful set of engagements that have led to some exciting results that we're going to share with you today. I think there's some, I don't know if other people see the gray boxes over the slides, but I'm not sure, Alison, it might be just something there if you could remove them. Anyhow, I'll start talking. So our work in Cape Town was really focused on informal settlements and flooding. The informal settlements in Cape Town, they're called many things, they go by many names, they exist for many reasons, but it's important, I think, that everyone have a clear understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about them. These informal settlements are the communities that spring up in often marginal lands all around the city. Yeah, there's some block boxes there, but I don't think it's blocking anything important, so don't worry about it. Thank you.
Sorry.
It's fine. These settlements pop up and all over. They're called by many names. I mean, we often think of the structures as shacks, and they are. I mean, they're very hastily built structures out of available materials. But the reality is that people live in them often for very long times. These are homes, and some of these communities end up becoming permanent. But when we think about them, in Cape Town in particular, it's important to think about them in terms of flooding as well, because they often exist in marginal lands, especially in the Cape Flats, where flooding is a major concern. Flooding is caused by many different types of weather and events in Cape Town listed here. And this flood map doesn't even begin to capture all the types of flooding, especially the ponding and the groundwater upwelling that could be major challenges there. Cape Town's been in the news a lot in the last decade for the major drought that occurred there and broke a couple of years ago. But flooding is also part of the problem there. Even during the drought, there were some significant floods. And you can imagine some of the overlap that has occurred because many people have moved to Cape Town in the period during the drought and settled in areas where it wasn't obvious that there might be a flood risk, and yet there was flood risk and it emerged, and it keeps emerging almost every year in the winter rainy seasons. Why do people live in the floodplain? It's a big question, and one that there's as many answers to as there are people in Cape Town, I think. But um, the bottom line is that there's not a lot of available lands, and people often, the most poor people get pushed into the most marginal lands, often areas that could flood. People also want to be near family, friends, their community, services. And so if there's some flood risk in the area where you're living, but you're near all those things, it may be something you want to do. Could you go to the next slide, please? So in these informal settlements, there are many different challenges. Health issues, lack of access to work, high crime, fires that spread house to house. But flooding is one of the major issues, even among all that competition. One big reason why is that it occurs almost every year in the wet season, and it can have a really profound impact on people's lives. Water can cause damage and injury. It can wash away a home. It can also linger for a long time, creating major health problems for the community itself. What you see there in the top picture is something which is happening a lot right now in Cape Town, where people are actually bringing fill and rubble into wetlands and expanding the informal settlements into them. Again, for those reasons that I described, to be near community, to be near services, to be near transportation. But the flood risk is especially high in those areas. Flooding is a problem not just because of the immediate impacts it has, though, but also because it negatively interacts with the long economic development path that these communities are on, and one that the city of Cape Town is trying to to help them along. The city is mandated by the Constitution in South Africa to provide services to these communities. So that includes things like you see along the bottom, like access to clean water, toilets, waste removal. But those essential services are really difficult to provide in an area that keeps flooding. There could be contamination issues, the infrastructure could be destroyed. But there's also a much even, I think, bigger question, which is if you're providing services to a community and they're living in a really dangerous place, are you creating an incentive for people to live in a space where it is too dangerous to live? Or how can these things be reconciled? These are big questions, they're big challenges, but the reality is that people are living in these areas, and the city is trying to balance these competing priorities. So our work was really focused on trying to understand the costs of this flooding. The reason understanding costs is important is because it's going to help the city identify and prioritize actions and responses. There's so many hundreds of thousands of Cape Townians living in informal settlements. Flooding is so widespread, it can be an overwhelming challenge. Having some data to understand where the risks are most severe and what the costs are can help prioritize those actions. Also, having this quantitative justification can really help the city build a stronger case for grant funding from the governments in Pretoria, as well as from the international donors and development agencies, as well as working with the private sector to bring in the financing needed to help address some of these challenges. Having more data about the costs can strengthen those cases. It's also important to understand the costs because understanding the costs, especially at a household level, is really one of those first steps necessary to ultimately begin to provide access to financing and insurance to these households that are generally, have no relationship with the bank, have no relationship with any type of financial products, even though those things might ultimately be of great help. So on the next slide, just going to give sort of an overview of the many different ways that we looked at costs. When flooding occurs in Cape Town, and really when flooding occurs anywhere, it's helpful to think about the many different costs and the many different people that are bearing those costs and the different times when those occur. So right off the bat, after flooding, there are some short-term and direct costs, and some of these are well understood. The city spends money on overtime for its employees and blankets and water and food for people who've been displaced. Aid agencies step in, providing relief. There's direct damage to assets. Many of these things are known, and when flooding happens each winter, you see big headlines all over Cape Town saying, you know, this many millions or billions of rand cost. But there are big gaps there. Those gaps include especially the impacts that are borne by those households. Another big gap, though, are the long-term impacts, because every time there's flooding, especially in these very vulnerable communities where people are living in really, makeshift and difficult conditions, a flood coming in, destroying belongings, creating health problems, has long-term impacts that ripple across the society and that continue across time. Things like an increase in gender-based violence, loss of ecosystem services, worsening health outcomes, and more. And so what we did in our assessment is try to look at all of these. Some of these were direct and quantitative, some were less so. If you could click again, Allison. Oh, sorry, just go back one more. There we go, thank you. Our goal here really was to put together as complete a picture as possible. Many of these costs hadn't been fully understood before or fully brought all together. Some were understood by some agencies, but not by others. What we tried to do was provide as comprehensive and complete a picture as possible. And so that ended up being kind of multidisciplinary. Some things were very financial, other things were not financial, but we tried to present all of these in tandem because together they create a comprehensive picture of the impact of flooding. We looked at things like, you know, the quantitative costs to rebuild shacks, which is a well-known number. But then we also looked at things like gender-based violence, which there are some estimates around, but it's a little bit more difficult to quantify. Our driving principle here was that we have a ton of data, and that data is useful and is built upon a strong academic and other foundations, and it is enough and of enough quality to drive decision-making and policy-making. So just to highlight here, we'll talk maybe more about this later in the discussion, but there were some things here where we were collecting data, especially around historic impacts and impacts to businesses, governments, aid agencies, sort of the more well-known data. Where we were able to add new value was by estimating costs and costs borne directly by informal households themselves. So using available data about the value of belongings people had in their homes, what it costs to rebuild, we were able to quantify and present, you know, in tandem along with the high level numbers, what the actual cost is to these communities. Looking at those more detailed financial estimates alongside the many long-term indirect impacts, I think created a strong and persuasive picture of the really incredible burden being borne by these communities, and really underlined the need for action. So I'm going to hand it off now to Daniel Sullivan, who's going to talk a little bit about the types of actions we recommend and where he sees this work going next. Daniel?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for running through the work. So essentially, Alison, you can move on to the next slide, thanks. So, I think what Peter's really framed up in the work that has been done in this piece, we've got to that point of trying to understand all of the different elements of costs associated with a flooding event. And then where the work went further, it started to look at, well, what are the current interventions and things that the city and stakeholders and the private sector and multiple parties are doing to try and mitigate the risk of flooding? And how can we start using this information around cost to give some acceleration to the work that's going on? So it is essentially, as Peter's indicated, that's a call to action. So we know that this is a significant cost borne by the city, borne by individuals, borne primarily by people in informal settlements. And now how do we go about protecting and making sure that we have a resilient and sustainable intervention or interventions that can help to prevent those losses occurring in the future? So if you have a look very briefly, these are a number of interventions that are going on in the city and in these informal settlements on an ongoing basis. Some of them have knock-on implications for other settlements, and we need to sort of understand how we get a cohesive or coherent planning framework together. But really, it's things around ongoing stormwater management, some nature-based solutions to bring green infrastructure solutions into spaces, looking at where we can put flood walls in place, improving river catchments or river areas, and the list goes on. But essentially, a number of these things are happening, and they're happening organically, but also at a small scale. And what we're really motivating is how do we start bringing all of these together through the platform that has been created, understanding what the cost of not doing these things are, and trying to motivate that we bring resources into the space to do more of and to do them at scale. So I think there's one more click, Alison. So this was really sort of to look at those recommendations across those 4 categories, which is strengthen and expand those initiatives that are going on. I mentioned a lot of those, but there is work going on. It's not to say that it isn't going on. It's just to give some impetus and some emphasis to it. As well as looking at policy changes, I think the most important policy change is actually how do we stop shooting ourselves in the foot, to use a term, but how do we start looking more systemically around where development happens, even if it is informal development? And part of that is really getting knowledge into people's hands to say, these are areas that you shouldn't be building in because of certain risks, or these are areas that you should be moving into because of risk. And a lot of that's because of in order to manage that risk. So a lot of that sort of resides in the settlements themselves and the communities themselves having that information to be able to make effective decisions. And then the exciting bit that Peter and the Howden Group in particular have been able to bring in is how does that private sector financing start flowing into these spaces? And if you look at the conversations we've had so far, it's how do we start putting in place things like a social impact bond that might be able to pay for some of the infrastructure development in stormwater or places that are prone to high levels of stormwater or high levels of flooding. And how can that come about through some level of innovative insurance product? So because there would be less flooding in the area, because this area is particularly safer, we can then invest with greater levels of confidence and then reduce the risk of future disaster risk type funding or future losses within those communities. So it's been a very exciting conversation that we've started to have with a number of funders around trying to pull these sorts of models together. And then I think the other important, probably, these recommendations don't necessarily seem in order. They all need to happen at the same time, but essentially getting data into the hands of people who are making decisions, both in trying to allow people to understand the risk of developing in certain areas, but also pre-warning about flooding risk in their neighborhood in the event of a few days in advance of a flood, for example, so that they can reduce that risk and the impact of the eventual flood. So altogether, very exciting work, and it has teed up, as I said, sort of brought together or created this platform upon which we can actually give a lot more momentum to a lot of the initiatives that are going on, but also start intervening with some new interventions, particularly in the finance space, to start bringing some finance and some funding into scaling some of the initiatives. I'm going to leave it there, and just to say again, thanks to Howden and the Resilient Cities Network for bringing this opportunity to us. But we will obviously take questions throughout the rest of the presentation. I think I'm handing over to Erin, though. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. So on to the next fellowship then. So that's Greater Manchester. So I think we'll, the slides, give it a couple of minutes for the slides to come on the screen. But I'll make a start anyway. So as the main water provider then for the city of Greater Manchester, it's vital then that United Utilities understands the true impact of severe storms, heavy rainfall and flooding on its asset portfolio and its entire network, as well as the consequences of these impacts then on society and on Greater Manchester. The urgency to understand the true extent of the impacts was highlighted in December 2015 when Storm Desmond, which was a severe storm which impacted the UK, caused financial losses to United Utilities, estimated at around £20 million, British pounds here. And the climate across Greater Manchester is changing. A recent report by Manchester Climate Change Agency that came out back in September of this year showed that winter precipitation, the rainfall that happens across the winter seasons, has increased by as much as 50% in the last 50 years. So it's a significant increase. And according to the UK climate projections, extreme rainfall events are predicted to increase in frequency, severity, and intensity over the coming decades by as much, with winter precipitation projected to increase by as much as actually 30% by 2050s. Modelling peak river flow as well. The recent report is suggesting that peak river flow could increase by as much as 70% by the year 2070s under high emission scenarios. So given this context, understanding then how climate change is going to impact the United Utilities' assets and the network is vital for Greater Manchester. And understanding how this risk profile is going to evolve over the coming decades. Next slide, please, Alison. So the primary goal with that in mind then of this fellowship was to support Greater Manchester Combined Authority in assessing the potential impact on their water services if the region's water supply company, United Utilities, does not take sufficient action to adapt to future flood risk under a range of different climate scenarios. So that was the primary sort of overarching focus that we had for the fellowship. And we could say that there was two sort of objectives as well for this particular fellowship. The first, which was to help United Utilities to better understand their risk and to build a compelling investment case to enhance their resilience and invest then in climate adaptation. The second objective plays into a wider objective as part of the UK government, which was to work with the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to build an understanding of how the private sector would tackle this sort of a question. And to inform then the next round of the UK government resilience framework. So hopefully this work will feed into the next UK government resilience framework, and that we can continue moving the conversation around climate resilience across the UK. A range of stakeholders, as you can see there, the bottom left here, a range of stakeholders were engaged throughout the fellowship, and we had specific stakeholder engagement meetings at critical parts of the last 7 to 8 months. And the fellowships include, the stakeholders include local authority representatives, the government representatives, infrastructure providers, so not only United Utilities, but also Transport for Greater Manchester and Electricity North West as well, in order to ensure we were capturing the cascading risks and the interdependency elements here. And we were lucky enough to also have flood consultants and flood modelers, so we can see JBA risk management and consultants here as well to bring in the flood risk perspective. And we also had climate consultants and risk advisors as part of this fellowship as well. So if we move on to the next slide, if we could have a quick look at the methodology that was applied to this particular fellowship then. To align with the IPCC's definition of climate risks, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition of risk, we need to look at hazards, exposure and vulnerability. All three components were considered as part of this risk assessment and tailored then to answer the question, how does the cost of flooding evolve for United Utilities over the future scenarios? So to ensure the robustness and alignment of this methodology with industry good practice, literature review and desktop-based research was carried out to make sure this was grounded in recent literature. And Arup's taxonomy that came out back in May of this year was a fundamental methodology that was used here as well. We also made sure to build upon literature which was specific for the city of Manchester to ensure that this was within the city resilience context as well. The fellowship outlines a methodology for conducting a site-specific climate risk assessment and it's broken down into 5 steps to quantify risk and to provide then recommendations around resilience actions for United Utilities. I'll quickly go through each of the 5 steps, but the first one then, the engage, that was building an understanding to begin with of United Utilities' asset portfolio. With over 3,000 assets across Greater Manchester, a methodology was defined in order to identify the most critical assets, which were vital then for water supply across Greater Manchester, and therefore a criticality criteria, vulnerability assessments and so forth were conducted in order to identify a top 5 assets to take forward to the rest of the fellowship. The discover stage then consisted of working with the flood consultants to run hydraulic models specifically for the 5 sites for a range of different scenarios, different emission scenarios, time horizons, and so forth, in order to understand the geospatial extent of flood risk at the specific assets. And we also ran industry standard loss models in order to also quantify the financial impact. And these models took into account asset-specific vulnerabilities. So that may include any existing flood protection measures, basements, electrical equipment, and so forth, to capture those kind of nuances as well. So this step sort of helped to build the understanding around the exposure, but then moving on to the 3rd step then, which was working with United Utilities to better understand then the impact of the flooding on these specific assets. So working closely with Adam then, who had the understanding of the specifics of these individual assets to identify direct, indirect, and cascading risks from flood risk, but also working with the other major infrastructure providers to identify those cascading impacts as well across Greater Manchester. If a particular asset was to be impacted by flooding, what would the impact be downstream? Would it be impacting data centres? Would it be impacting transport, etc., and so forth? The plan stage then consisted of a cost-benefit analysis to a range of different adaptation options that United Utilities may wish to include, and these included not only sort of traditional harder engineering sort of measures, but also nature-based solutions, capacity building, and government's recommendations. So a range of different adaptation actions. And then last but not least, insights from a range of different stakeholders, including a nature investment organisation, and sort of insight then from Howden from that risk management perspective. I'll pass over to Sharon now to share a little bit of insights from GMCA's perspective and any sort of value that you derive from the fellowship. Sharon.
Thanks very much, Erin. And good afternoon to everybody on the call, and thank you for joining us. So, as Erin said, I just wanted to share some of our key benefits from the fellowship in Greater Manchester. And I think really one of the key highlights for us has been the strong collaboration between public and private sector professionals to better understand this complex challenge. By working together, we've developed a shared understanding of flood risk impacts to water infrastructure and leveraged private sector tools to inform future adaptation and resilience building investment strategies. Through this particular piece of work, we've gained valuable insights into how more frequent and severe flooding through climate change can impact on critical assets that supply water to our city region, and the costs of not protecting those assets against future flood risk and climate risks in general. And this understanding is crucial for developing a robust evidence base to drive greater investment and action on climate resilience. Cross-sector engagement has also been extremely important. That's helped us to understand, as Erin mentioned earlier, the interdependencies between major infrastructure providers, and it's highlighted that need to better understand cascading climate risks and their impacts. The insurance sector has played a fundamental role in this project, demonstrating how it can quantify the cost of exposure of assets to current and future flood risk and the cost of failing to adapt those assets. but also how private sector approaches can be effectively used to support national government and policymakers in resilience planning for climate risk. As part of the fellowship, a methodology has been developed for assessing the financial cost of flood risk at a local level. And that blueprint has the potential to be applied to other hazards beyond flooding, which helps us to inform future investment strategies for climate resilience and preparedness. And that methodology is not only beneficial for us here in Greater Manchester, but it also serves as a valuable tool for other cities in the UK and around the world, supporting global efforts to build urban resilience. And to conclude, I think the project's really been extremely valuable as a whole, but it's demonstrated the importance of investing now in prevention to help to reduce future financial costs. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Adam. He'll just talk a little bit more about the benefits of the fellowship outcomes for United Utilities.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, and just for sort of reference from an international perspective, it's worth pointing out that the majority of infrastructure provision within England and Wales is actually privately owned and operated. So it's from a risk management to sort of traditional sort of municipality that perhaps own multiple infrastructure services. I think the key benefit for UU being involved in this project has been to understand what best case flood risk assessment looks like. I think we've always had a view of what flood risk looks like to us, and we have a lot of our asset base is exposed to flood risk naturally because it's it's closely associated with lakes and rivers. But in undertaking the work and the work that Resilient Cities Network and how to be able to pull together for us is to actually understand how we can evolve our existing methodology, which looks very much at the risk exposure from an insurance perspective rather than necessarily the full service impact. I think is going to help us inform our methodology for when we rerun the flood risk assessments when some new national data sets on flood risk are produced in the next few months. I think it's linking to what Sharon said about the sort of cooperation between different infrastructure providers has been really invaluable. I think having that sort of private public voice on how public risk and private risk is being managed across the different infrastructure providers has been really helpful, especially from a compound risk perspective. Many of our sites will be at risk of flooding, and we may choose to invest to protect them in the future if we can make the business case. But actually, we're still reliant upon the services of others that also need to be protected. And that's one of the key things that came out of this was the call to arms, as it were, to our sort of central government perspective on better data sharing of risks. So when companies in different sectors have understood their flood exposure risk, what is the cascading impacts? And we're using this as to help us as a sort of a call to arms to government to establish more complete resilience standards across the different multiple sectors. I think that will then really help us to secure a sort of more resilient UK to flooding risk in particular. Like I say, we're about to rerun our flood risk assessment, and we're going to be embedding the work that Erin and the Howden team have developed for us into our latest flood risk assessment. And I believe I'm now handing over to Wadeza and Alison for the Q&A.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks to everyone for sharing and for going deep into the projects that we've been very involved in over the last 8 months. It's been quite a process and exciting to see where we've ended up. We have lots of questions in the chat, but I wanted to start, Adam, just to touch on what you had kind of finished on and where this work goes from here. The learnings from this fellowship project, how do you envision that it's going, in what sense will it directly inform the way that United Utilities can use this work to justify the investment into adaptation and into resilience in a way that looks different than previously?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question, Alison. And this was a conversation we were having with our sort of internal boards yesterday, actually, about how we're going to integrate this. So I think the current risk assessment that we complete is very much based at infrastructure risk or loss of infrastructure and recovery cost from a very sort of traditional sort of vanilla type of insurance, sort of standard insurance. One of the ways we're trying to look at this is actually how can some of the additional impacts of flooding, so whether that be loss of access to site, let alone just the damage, the service level impact that the loss of a treatment works then has on a city, the potential economic losses that city then incurs off the back of a loss of water. How can we use those sort of the value we can get from protecting those to increase the sort of chance of the cost benefit analysis of actually delivering some flood alleviation schemes? Because I think if you look at them in a very traditional way of, I've got a concrete asset that is at risk of flooding, what's the damage going to be to it? It's actually quite difficult to make the business case stand up. Whereas if you can add in additional value to be added from it, then that's where it starts to strengthen your business case. And Erin mentioned the involvement with Rebalance Earth and the sort of looking at actually changing focus completely to away from physical hardening to nature-based ecosystem, so natural flood management options as well. So it's
Oh, Adam, your audio is cut for a moment. We can't hear you. Right.
It's helping us to identify where the biggest risks are. We are prepared to invest in. Right. Okay. Sorry. I've got me. I'll try stuff.
Can I pass
Sorry.
to you to ask the next question then?
Absolutely. Sorry, Adam, we missed what was probably an interesting end to your question. There was a bit of a lag, but hopefully if another question swings around, the sound is back up. I'll go to a question from the Q&A box for the Cape Town team. And it's from Jane Katz, who asked, does the massive data collected in Cape Town feed into the national government databases for sustainable development goals and other global reporting? And how is community data accepted in your experience? That ground up data, how is that accepted? And then first part of the question is, does the data collected feed into kind of global reporting and considerations around the SDGs?
Thanks for this. I'll try and take that one. So I think at the moment, I mean, as crudely, maybe the answer is not yet, rather than not no. So, this has been really important data gathering to try and understand what the risks are, and sort of to feed that into multiple spaces, including to sort of non-traditional stakeholders who have an interest in this space. So at the moment, the data is still, dare I say, not auditable or audited, and therefore so can't formally feed into those systems, but it does feed in a qualitative manner to try and understand risk. But I think because we've got within the South African municipal environment, we have a disparity of data. It would actually, it wouldn't align. Cape Town has some very dense, rich data, qualitative data, but some other municipalities and some other areas of the country may not necessarily have the same data gathered in the same way. So it is still a process that we need to go through to try and pull some standards together around this. But for now, we're just seeing it as this is the Cape Town's attempt to try and quantify it, and from that attempt to bring in different stakeholders. I think maybe just to add on to sort of the end of what Adam was also mentioning, if I can, around understanding who in this environment has value at risk, and then those stakeholders should then have an interest in trying to be part of the solution. So I think Adam was sort of alluding to that, which is really quite exciting in the way that it's been done in the UK context. Whereas in the South African context, we might not be quite as sophisticated as putting rands and cents to it, but it is really important to start building all of those that sort of coalition of stakeholders to see who actually has value at risk and therefore who should be part of the solution, and bringing it out of a traditional insurance conversation to more of a how do we ensure or underwrite the economic growth or economic trajectory of the city or of the area. I hope that that comment makes sense, but I'm happy to expand on that if it doesn't.
Thank you, Daniel.
I'd be
Peter,
happy to
would
also
you-
just say a little bit about the community data part of it too. Yeah, just Jane, to answer the question around how community data is accepted. You know, because we were describing in our work the costs borne by informal households, it was really important to you know, speak to the communities as much as possible. But we also had to be creative in how we kind of found the data, because there just isn't a ton of it available, and these communities are often so you know, either off the grid or transient or difficult to engage with. We had to think creatively, so we were able to pull data on sort of the value of people's belongings and the costs of rebuilding and the income that they might be losing in the event of a disaster. We pulled this from sources including a number of academic studies that have been done in and around Cape Town and South Africa, as well as working with one of the only sort of insurance providers that works directly with these communities, a small organization called Lumkani that provides fire insurance to informal households. They had some unique insights that were really valuable. And then the third big data source we relied on for community data was from some of the community development organizations that work extremely closely and intensively with the informal settlements. And you know, these organizations just do, you know, incredible work on the front lines every day, real advocates for the communities, and real you know, I think just yeah, tireless members of the community. But they had a lot of data that they told us about early on, but didn't initially want to share. They were like, you know, who are you first? You know, it took us a long time to get this data. We don't want to give it out quickly. And so what we did, and I think one of the strengths of the fellowship, is that we did have, you know, many months to work on this project, many times for repeated engagement, repeated visits to the communities, repeated in-person meetings. And by the end of it, we had, you know, won the trust of some of these local groups, and they started sharing their data with us. And that's been incredibly valuable to get to that point. And I, you know, really respected their sort of desire to yeah, to make us work for it in a way, to get to that point where it was really demonstrated that we were committed to this work, that we had done a lot of the other analysis and research, and that their data was able to help complement and strengthen in a really meaningful way. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you, Daniel, for that input. Thank you, Jane, for the questions. Just a reminder that if you have any other questions, as we kind of have about 10 minutes left, feel free to pop them in the chat. But now a question, probably first to the Greater Manchester team, but one that the Cape Town team can reflect on as well. And it's around the ways that these fellowship projects acted as a way to convene multiple stakeholders who share risk and share the capacity to respond to this, to risk, to think through solutions, and to essentially just share information, which I think was a valuable outcome of both projects. Sharon, during the Greater Manchester Fellowship, you worked with the team to think through both the impacts of flood on United Utilities, but the interdependencies between those impacts for United Utilities and the impacts for other utility and infrastructure providers. Can you say a little bit more about the utility of having that kind of at the center of the project, and how Greater Manchester might work to convene other infrastructure providers to consider cascading impacts of flood on one infrastructure provider for another, and the importance of that for strengthening Greater Manchester's resilience?
Thanks, Wadeza. I think we talked earlier in the project about how we'd looked at interdependencies as part of the fellowship. And it was important really for us in Greater Manchester, even though this was based around water infrastructure, to recognise that there is an impact to other major infrastructure providers, and that we need to work across all parties, cross-sector, to understand what those impacts are, and how by addressing it through one party, we can work together to address it across multiple infrastructure providers. So in this particular project, we'd brought in at a quite early stage other infrastructure providers, such as Transport for Greater Manchester, and also Electricity Northwest, so that we could explore with them how the fellowship would work, not just for United Utilities, but how it would work for them as well. I think one of the key parts along the route of this, well, the fellowship that we've been on, we've actually delivered engagement sessions where we've brought together all different stakeholders into the same room to discuss the project at different stages. And that's been not just a case of sharing where we are with the project, but also getting input from different stakeholders and different infrastructure providers to help to inform and shape the project as well. And giving people an opportunity to say where those impacts are, to say where those interdependencies come in. And I think that's been a really useful way of broadening the project to other people beyond just the core fellowship group. And what our hope is that now, as we're coming to the close of the fellowship, that we don't stop the conversations, that we continue that collaboration, and that we're able to use the methodology to share it with other infrastructure providers, but also much wider than that across other networks, to help to build resilience and to help to think about cascading impacts and how we respond to them in terms of future risk.
Perhaps I can add just to what Sharon's just said there. I think what became apparent throughout the stakeholder engagements as well was, and quite an interesting perspective, which was around not only the difficulty that these major infrastructure providers are having in terms of mapping their own asset portfolios, their own networks, and their own understanding of how climate risk is going to be impacting them, but then the difficulty of being able to share that information between each other, which is a second sort of barrier, a hurdle in the way, let alone then the third component, which is actually mapping how the cascading risks and the actual true extent and the true impacts of those cascading risks and the interdependencies. So there is a chance that we are underestimating the severity of climate risk because we are looking at individual assets, as individual organisations, as opposed to that sort of the broader cascading risks at a wider level. And the call to action to government and to Cabinet Office that Adam mentioned before as well. That's one of the key recommendations that we have asked the Cabinet Office representatives to feed back to government, is around that sort of data sharing aspect of things and actually capturing cascading risks as well.
Yeah,
Thanks.
if my network stays up, which is, you think in a big utility headquarters should be okay. But yeah, I think just to emphasize that the point of Sharon and Erin there, the way the UK's infrastructure sort of supplies are regulated can actually trip you up. So we find actually sharing information, but also investing. So, for example, investing in power resilience or telecoms resilience for a water company is seen as inefficient use of customers' funding because it's not actually their responsibility. And yet, when telecom, we've lots of studies been shown that when telecom, power, or water fails, the other two are very quick afterwards because of the interdependency between those linkages. So yeah, that's one of the biggest outputs of this is that call to arms and the evidence base to be able to call into to Cabinet Office in particular. I think individual sectors have got very good at understanding their risk, and I think it is a next phase now of understanding how we play with each other, and obviously anything that we can use to help strengthen that argument, that call to arms, is of benefit.
Thanks for the comments from the Greater Manchester team. I think that collaboration has been something that throughout the last 2 years of the fellowship we've seen as such an asset to each of the unique projects that we undertake. Daniel and Peter, I don't know if you wanted to have any other comments on kind of the convening power of the fellowship. Peter, you touched on it in terms of the data sharing, but Daniel, I don't know if you wanted to comment as well on what this is enabled you and the team to do and take forward.
Well, I'm happy to say a little bit more, but Daniel, feel free to jump in. Yeah, I think coming into the work and spending time in Cape Town, sort of one question that would come to my mind sometimes, and a few people asked me directly a couple times, was, why are you here from New York? Like, what could you offer to this community? And I had some ideas about it, but I think over the course of the fellowship, it became clear that it can be useful sometimes to have an outside perspective and outside, organization come in. In this case, I think it was particularly useful because we came in, of course, with a fresh perspective, and there's a really contentious, complex issues. Having an outside view can be just valuable and fresh under any circumstances. But I think another thing that we were able to do was sort of help, spark the convening of a really wide array of stakeholders. Not just the many city departments who all hold a piece of the puzzle when it comes to flooding and informal settlements, but also the many academics who are working in ways large and small around these issues, as well as the many aid organizations and relief organizations and community development organizations that are all on the ground with the communities every day. And then, of course, as well with the private sector, big banks and insurers who want to do more to serve the poorest communities in South Africa, as well as interesting startups providing new technology and new financial and insurance products. And so being the outside convener, being able to come in and say, I see all this stuff you're doing. We see how all these things could fit together. This thing could be amplified. This thing could be connected. I think ended up being a valuable role, and we got a lot of positive feedback about that. But that's my take on it. I wonder what Daniel thinks about the collaborations.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Peter, you've said it better than I would have. It essentially having the momentum behind this project, or this work, has been extremely useful because everybody falls in there, and dare I say, I'm going to use the word silos, or their sort of professional streams or their areas of interest. And what really happened with this work is the way that it was crafted and the way that it was undertaken. It was able to pick the threads up from the various components and bring them all into a platform, and really allow everybody to see themselves as part of the solution, or their parts in the solution, and also to identify the risks that they may not have seen within their own space. So the traditional insurance space didn't necessarily dabble in the informal sector space, and now understanding that actually the informal sector space has a major risk to Cape Town's economy, and if we don't get that right, we're not going to see the promised economic growth that we all aspire to. So trying to see how the insurance space can start operating in those spaces a little bit more readily, as well as bringing in the non-traditional alternative financing options. So it's very timely in an intervention from Resilient Cities, bringing the focus to this topic. And now we have the framing and the stakeholders who are all actively engaged now to try and see, well, how do we take our various pieces together, knowing that our pieces contribute to a much larger picture.
Thank you, Daniel, and also a big thank you to everyone who has participated in this session, but also to our fellows and panelists. This work is really unique to the network and unique to this type of private and public sector collaboration. And I just put the 2024 fellowship report into the chat. So if anybody would like to read that, it will give you an idea of some of the other projects that we undertook with 3 other cities in these last months. We encourage you also to reach out to the teams or to Wadesa or myself for any further questions or comments. We will be launching the next cohort of the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship in 2025. So please keep your eyes out for that. The recording and the summary of this session will be live on our website, and we will be kicking off Cities on the Frontline again in January. So thank you, everyone, from wherever you are attending from today, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.